My name is Kathleen Meil, and I live in Rockport, which is the Maine headquarters of Acadia Center. We're actually a regional organization, and I will, are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. Give you a little bit of background about who we are before we delve into community energy actions and specifically microgrids today. So Acadia Center is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization, and we're committed to advancing the clean energy future. So we do that through work at the state and regional levels in all of the Northeast states. We're really focused on the consumer and economic benefits of the clean energy future because, to be honest, those of us who are here in this room today are probably already on board with all of the environmental and public health and benefits for Andrew and his peers. So really talking a lot about the economic benefits of these advances is the way to gain traction with the folks who we still need to build alliances with. Acadia Center's work centers on 4 interrelated initiatives. We work on energy efficiency, we work on grid modernization, we work on clean energy and carbon markets, and we work on the electrification of transportation and buildings, which, believe it or not, Maine is actually the leader in the Northeast on the heat pump movement. So it's nice to have that gold star next to our name. We could use some others, and we'll talk about that too. So there's a little bit of street cred there. Acadia Center has been around for almost 20 years and does a lot of good work. So it's an honor to be part of that organization and to talk to you guys today. So this is a picture from Portland a couple of weeks ago, flooding down on Commercial Street and on the piers. It's a reminder of what we already know, which is that our communities are really vulnerable and increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, right? We've got increased flooding, we have more severe storms. Remember that $75 million power outage that we had back in October that we will pick up the bill for as ratepayers. These are serious and growing impacts. We need to have a greener and more reliable, more resilient electric grid, both from the supply side all the way to the transmission and distribution and use of energy side. But we're seeing less and less action at the federal level. The last year has not been good for a lot of the issues that a lot of us care about, and the environment and clean energy are no exception. We see appliance standards at risk. We see the Clean Power Plan which was based in large part on a lot of good work that started here in Maine and led to the Regional Greenhouse Initiative. Things aren't going so well. We see with all of those blows, though, a really good response from the state and community and regional level. So we see more and more states talking about state appliance efficiency standards, which didn't seem to be necessary when we had strong federal standards. Renewable portfolio standards. I came here from a hearing in Augusta to talk about Maine's renewable portfolio standard, which could use a little bolstering. But we see a lot of good work at the state level, and we see more and more emphasis on communities. Communities are really on the front lines of climate action at this point. And that's both because we have to be, and because there are so many market-ready technologies that will help us take control of our energy system, increase our energy efficiency, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and with all of the health benefits and local air quality benefits that brings, and also keep our energy dollars in the local economy. Maine is not a fossil fuel producing state, but we are a solar producing state. We are a wind energy producing state. There are lots of ways that we can keep those energy dollars at home. And by spreading that work across the community level as opposed to individual rooftop solar projects, we can really increase the availability of lots of people to access clean energy. So I talked to a bunch of you as you came in, and I know a lot of you live in Portland. You may not have a great south-facing roof for enough solar access. You may end up being in an apartment building or a condo where you don't have access to the roof at all. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have access to clean solar energy. So we're seeing a lot of initiatives across the country, from the big national ones like Sierra Club's Ready for 100, or the We Are Still In, where the mayors and governors are stepping up to say, I don't care what the president says, we're still meeting our Paris climate obligations, to local, really small, but really targeted, really responsive to the immediate needs of the community efforts like A Climate to Thrive. I don't know how many of you know about that. It's based on MDI and bringing all of the communities together there to tackle all of these aspects of a clean energy future. CB, which is Center for an Ecology-Based Economy. It's based in Western Maine. I can't remember the town. Thank you, Norway. and they're also doing a lot of really locally responsive things. But they either have or will run into some roadblocks. And that's because the options that communities have available to them are limited by state policy and by state rules and regulations. So about 2 months ago, Acadia Center released the Community Energy Vision Action Guide. This is a really cool, super user-friendly tool that shows what communities can do in a couple of different categories of clean energy action across the Northeast states. So this is a way that you can say, all right, when it comes to buildings like building codes or siting and permitting decisions or energy benchmarking, what can we do in our cities and towns in Maine compared to what our neighbors can do in New Hampshire or our neighbors in Massachusetts or our neighbors in New York? And it does the same for local energy, clean energy generation and delivery and purchasing. That's where you get into what are the solar, rooftop solar rules? What are the community solar rules? Right now, under current state law in Maine, you can only have 10 people pool together to create a community solar farm. Our neighbors don't have those kinds of artificial limits placed on them. So I like to think of the action guide as not just a checklist of what we already could do and therefore should be doing, but also the sort of friendly competition of, what do you mean we can't do that? What do you mean we can't make zoning and siting decisions that encourage clean energy districts, but our neighbors can? Or the financial incentives. We actually have some good tools available to us, but we can see what the options are throughout the region and where we should have more. So we're going to go a little bit deeper today into one of those categories, which is the local generation and delivery, and specifically microgrids. Microgrids are both a buzzword and a really buzz topic right now. So you've probably heard something about them. You may not have the full background, and that's because it's really kind of complicated and it brings in a whole bunch of state and federal regulations that we've got to think about. So I stole this diagram from the Center for Sustainable Energy because it was one of the most clear that I found. And what you can see here is the little circle with the parentheses around it. That's the connection point. So to the left of that is the utility grid. This is what the vast majority of us are hooked up to now. Right. To the right of that is sketched out the elements of a microgrid. So a microgrid is a way of managing the load and the response to all of the energy needs of whatever that microgrid serves. So it could be one building. So the simplest version of a microgrid would be a hospital that has a backup diesel generator so it can still have power when the rest of the state doesn't. But when we're talking about microgrids, we're usually thinking a little bit more broadly, where it's more of a neighborhood or a whole municipality. If any of you have been to the Brunswick Renewable Energy Center, it was repurposed from the former Naval Air Station there, and they've got a microgrid in operation. It's really, really cool. It's also really operating under a different set of circumstances because it used to be a military base. It was never a town that was connected to the grid in the way that our towns are. So a lot to learn, but what I like about this diagram is that it points out a bunch of the elements of a microgrid. You've got how you generate your energy, which, as I said, could be as basic and fossil fuel intensive as a diesel generator, but that's not what we're shooting for. So you see the renewables there. You see storage is more and more important in the long-term viability of microgrids, and also increasingly affordable. You see electric vehicles, which can actually serve multiple roles. Not only are they drawing power from the grid, but if we had a different grid that allowed for two-way power flow, they could be a storage component and a generating component at some points. And then you see all of the users, the residential, the commercial, the industrial. We also tend to talk about one kind of microgrid, though there are actually three. A microgrid that is always islanded, this is what we would call off the grid, right? This is not connected at all. This is you and your buddy build a house and put up solar panels, and CMP doesn't have anything to do with you. Or your island does that. There's also the always grid tied. So this is, you have solar on your roof, but unfortunately you have a lot more to do with CMP than you might like. We're usually looking at the middle category, the kind of microgrid that can flip a switch and be either grid tied and help build some capacity and insulating value for the whole grid by being a storage center, or flip that switch and say, I don't know what's going on in the rest of the state, but our town is going to retain essential services. So that's the basics of microgrids. And as I said, the most simple version would be a building plus a generator. There are a couple of goals that we're all shooting for here, to have a greener grid, a more reliable grid, and a more resilient grid. The building plus generator is more resilient. It can keep the lights on in the hospital when the rest of the state is dark. But it's not greener. It's still fossil fuel dependent, which means it has all of the emissions problems, but also means it has all the vulnerability to fuel prices and to fuel access. And it's not more reliable. This is one of the most alarming things that I learned in doing some research here, is how is the failure rate of this kind of microgrid is so high, because you don't turn it on unless there's an emergency. It's not like it's constantly being operated and maintained and monitored. It's just, uh-oh, what do we do now? So basic microgrids, though they are technically microgrids, are not what we're talking about. We really want modern microgrids. And this is where we talk about a network of community buildings, and that could eventually include the entire community, but would probably start with some critical facilities and aggregated resources. So this is a way to incorporate distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, though not exclusively rooftop solar, onto the grid. It's a way that we can add capacity and therefore stability to the larger grid. This also helps us defer some super expensive infrastructure upgrades. If any of you followed the Booth Bay pilot a couple of years ago, you know that the Maine Power and Reliability Project proposed a, what was it, $18 million line, new line down the Boothbay Peninsula. And a lot of people said, well, geez, do we need that? And through a process at the Public Utilities Commission, got permission to do a pilot to say, can a combination of storage and renewable energy and energy efficiency eliminate the need for that new line? And the answer was, yeah, to the tune of a savings of $11 million. We met those reliability needs at a far lower cost than that infrastructure investment, which would have been spread out over all of us. So that's a good thing. More resilient, because microgrids are integrated in a more ongoing basis than that diesel generator that gets turned on or off. They're more resilient. They can operate on their own. They're always operating. They can go back and forth. We know what the issues are. We can incorporate demand response. And then finally, we've got a lot more local control. We can keep those renewable energy dollars in the economy, and communities really are empowered to take control of their own energy system and to figure out what are our priorities and how can our energy system reflect those. So one example, again, this is a great case study from the Community Energy Vision Action Guide, is in Rutland, Vermont. So this picture here is of a former landfill that is now covered with 2.5 megawatts of solar. There's also 4 megawatts of battery storage. This is the first exclusively solar plus storage microgrid in the country. Usually you've got some other energy sources feeding into that. And it's capable of managing the load, of providing, you'll hear this term if you get too deep into the microgrid literature, of ancillary services, which is basically all of the behind the scenes tweaking that makes the grid work. So the right voltage and frequency coming through at the right time in response to this, and all of those things that utilities will sometimes tell us renewable power can't accommodate. It's too unpredictable. The sun only shines half the time. We can get some of those renewable or those ancillary services from a grid like this. The combination of solar and storage means that the critical facilities that the Stafford Hill solar farm powers can be powered indefinitely. That's pretty cool. The people of Rutland could lose power for 6 months, and this solar farm would keep the lights on at the emergency shelter and the critical facilities. It also makes money for their town, because they've leased this land to Green Mountain Power. They make money from the energy that they store and then put onto the grid, and they get the renewable energy credits, which we're not even going to talk about how that works, but is a way of incentivizing investment in renewable energy. So it's really a win-win, and you're probably thinking like, yeah, let's do that, that's great. Oh boy, this is when you have to pull out your action guide and take a look, because you will see that though our friends in Vermont and New Hampshire have a green light for developing a municipal microgrid, and our friends in Rhode Island and New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut could try their luck because there's nothing explicitly prohibiting them from doing so. In fact, Rhode Island is slowly slogging its way through some microgrid legislation, and Connecticut has some really good microgrid pilots. In Maine, we have a red light. Nope, can't do that. Well, why not? Microgrids in Maine face a couple of categories of challenges. The first one is, what do we call them? They're not exactly energy generators, though they do generate energy. They're not exactly energy distributors, though they do distribute energy. And they're not exactly consumers, though they do connect consumers and consume energy. There's also the question of what a community really means. Are we talking about a municipality, or are we talking about a geographical area that makes sense and is centrally located? We have some municipalities in Maine that include far-flung communities that are absolutely not a logical choice for a microgrid. So what do we mean when we say community? And then what's the level of utility involvement? Because if we want to be connected, remember that little circle with the parentheses around it? If we're going to be able to connect that microgrid to the larger grid, we're going to have to get those grid operators and other utilities online or on board. Right now, utilities have the power to deny any interconnection request. They can say, nope, you can't add your power source to our grid. The control is a huge technical and financial hurdle, and some of the utility objections are really reasonable. How do they know when we're going to decide to flip the switch one way or another? How do they account for that? Who tells them, and who do they tell? Who's running this thing? And that doesn't even get into the compensation, which if you've been following the solar debate in Maine over the last, lo these many years, is a huge issue. How are community microgrids compensated for those ancillary services that they provide to the grid? And how are power generators, to the folks who have distributed energy resources, how are they being compensated for the energy they're putting onto the grid? So we can object to the fact that we've got a red light, but there are a lot of things to sort through. Luckily, we're trying to sort through them. So there is a bill before the legislature right now called an Act to Enable Municipalities Working with Utilities to Establish Microgrids. Representative Mick Devon, who sponsored the bill, is from one of those municipalities that has a lot of far-flung communities that don't make sense to connect. So I don't think the title of this bill has changed, but he's definitely tweaking it to be more community and less municipality. His hope is to remove the structural barriers to creating a community microgrid by answering a bunch of those questions that we talked through. And to establish more microgrid-friendly regulations. We also need to have more utility-friendly regulations built in there too, because their cooperation is absolutely essential to this being able to go forward. So we've got to establish rates for power generation and stored power usage and ancillary services. If you don't have anything to do at this time tomorrow, the Energy Committee will be having a work session. They've done a ton of thinking and talking about microgrids over the last few months. They did a bunch actually between the end of the first session and beginning of this current session. And there's a lot of good progress being made in thinking about how to move forward with microgrids. It has a new urgency too after that October windstorm. That storm left 2/3 of our state without power. At the same time, or a few weeks earlier, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. That left 100% of Puerto Rico without power. And we talked a lot about that, but what you might not know, because we have a great way of stopping talking about things when we get bored of them, is that 40% of Puerto Rico is still without power, 4 months later. A lot of people are jumping in with ideas about how microgrids could be the solution, because when you talk about a rural state like Maine or a mountainous island like Puerto Rico, distribution is a huge challenge. So microgrids are a way of shrinking that distribution network and providing resources where we need them. That was not a practical way to distribute energy when we were talking about coal-fired power plants, right? You're not going to build one of those in every town. But you can build a solar panel in every town. In fact, you should. It's far more, modern technologies let us make much smarter decisions that keep this control much more local and much more resilient. So that's sort of the high level view of where we are in microgrids. I brought cards which have, in addition to my contact information, the Acadia Center website, where you can actually download that Community Energy Action Guide if you want to take a look at it. And I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can, or to hear what you guys are thinking about, or where you are in your community energy journey.
I'd love to talk just a little bit about the Booth Bay, because I maintain that it is Maine's best kept secret. And I participated some in it. I live in Edgecombe, so right near there, and watched it develop. And one of the things that I found so interesting was that part of the savings was that they offered to businesses LED lights, whatever you needed. And Booth Bay has a lot of art galleries, and lighting is how you sell art. And they were ecstatic about their new lights that they had. So obviously, if these come free, it's great, but it was also LED when this happened. It was still fairly new to people. They also brought in something called Ice Bears, which was a place to test this technology where at night they would make ice when you had lower cost for energy, less demand, and so actual cost was less. And then during the day they would run air over this ice. This was an air conditioning way, but what people found was, because they put in the LED lights, they didn't need so much air conditioning. So there were a lot of really important local ahas that happened. And if you go down to Booth Bay Harbor and drive around, the Y is covered with solar panels. The flagship motel has something like 105, and then municipal buildings. So it was a boon, but it was also good for ratepayers because of the savings that you mentioned, Kathleen. So I wish that somehow what has already been documented, that it was front page story in these times.
Well, and it's true, what's interesting about Booth Bay, and I suspect why the pilot was authorized in the first place, is because it is such a seasonal community. Because the energy costs peak for a very small portion of the year, it was easy to make the case that if you could meet that load demand on this handful of days, that you wouldn't need greater capacity for the rest of the year. So in some ways, it was a huge ask, but it was also a pretty straightforward ask. And the load growth that CMP had actually predicted did not materialize over the course of the project. So their response was sort of, isn't that proof that we didn't have to do this at all? But the fact is that all of those efficiency measures reduced demand and save people money day in and day out, regardless, even if you don't think about that transmission line that we didn't have to build. Those gallery owners pay less in their electricity rates because they use more efficient lighting. The Y has a lower operational cost because they don't have to pay for their electricity, they're generating it on the roof. That means the Y actually gets to spend money doing what the Y does best, which is supporting kids and families. So there are all of these other benefits that follow when we put those dollars back in the pockets of local consumers and local organizations and save ourselves money. And that's before we even talk about the climate and the public health benefits of reducing our carbon intensity of our energy mix. So I feel like one of the things that is always exciting and frustrating to me about this work is the stories that I sort of breathe in and out every day that feel so inspiring and make these advances seem so inevitable to me are not as widely known as I feel like they are, and as I know they should be. So it's really great to be able to share them with you today. It's so exciting that this is going to be on the community access, and more people will get to hear about it and say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And concern about solar is that the sun does not, in fact, always shine, and that we like to use energy at night too. And so storage helps answer that question on a homeowner basis, but it also, when you talk about microgrids and you talk about large-scale storage, you're making renewable energy more reliable on the larger scale, and more, that argument that, well, you can always fire up that power plant, well, you can always fire up your battery. And so one of the things that California has done, other states may have, Maine has not yet, but have actually started to call for storage as part of their renewable portfolio standards. So the renewable portfolio standard is a policy that requires the electricity load in a state to be generated at a certain target from renewable sources. So Maine's RPS was established in 1999, and it said 30% of the electricity in the state of Maine has to come from a renewable resource. That actually was not a particularly effective policy because we already had surpassed that target by the time it was set. But by about 10 years ago, there was a distinction drawn between new renewables like solar and wind primarily, and existing renewables like hydro and biomass. And that target inched up slowly. We still have a long way to go, but by calling for, so in many states, what they're doing is actually saying, we're not just going to have class 1 and class 2 RPS, we're going to have a solar RPS, and we're going to have a wind RPS, and we're going to have a storage RPS, because we need to be specific about the kind of energy mix that we need to be reliable and resilient and low carbon. So there's a lot, and I would hope that Maine will have a much more comprehensive discussion about the RPS next year, and that storage will certainly be part of that conversation, especially since we can point to a homegrown local company that is, as Brittany said, on the map for battery storage. It makes sense for us to support them just as much as we support biomass. And it could work, right? We could incentivize manufacture of solar panels here. But for that to really work, we have to have a consistent policy to promote the sale and purchase of solar. And we actually have policies in place in a number of states, including our own, that does the opposite. We try to make it harder for people to buy solar, not easier. So if we want to create a domestic market for solar panels, we also have to create a domestic demand for solar. And I don't think you have to be a policy expert to see that there's a disconnect there.
How important is McDevin's bill, and is it the only solar bill in this short
It is the only microgrid bill. It is not actually the bill that addresses the solar legislation. That will also, that's actually will probably go to a floor vote in the next week or two to do some of the things that we tried to do last session.
There was a big bill.
Right, and so this tries to accomplish a core group of those, raising the limit on community solar, stopping the crazy behind the meter fee that said you've got to have another meter, and I'm going to use the example that everybody keeps saying that I love of like Hannaford charging you for the tomatoes that you grow in your own garden. It would stop that. It doesn't create a proactive solar policy, but it hits pause on some really bad legislation that we have right now. The McDevins McDevin. Sorry, I was combining that. The microgrid bill, I think, is generating a lot of really good conversation and a lot of really good awareness raising and education on the Energy Committee specifically, and the broader legislature and broader community, because this stuff is complicated and there are legitimate technological questions and regulatory challenges, and all of that has to be sorted out. Whether it gets sorted out satisfactorily in this short session or not, it's out there, and it won't. Some legislation to look at what they call non-transmission alternatives, which is what we technically call the Booth Bay pilot. Microgrid proponents call it a microgrid. NTA proponents call it an NTA. It's the same thing. Microgrid usually implies that there's that off switch where you can island from the grid, but the overall concept is the same, of renewable resources plus storage plus efficiency plus demand management equals a more resilient, more cost-effective, lower carbon grid. So there's some work, some legislation to address how we consider non-transmission alternatives in the transmission planning process. So when CMP says we need to build a line down the Booth Bay Peninsula, what's the protocol to make sure somebody has the opportunity to say, hey, wait, couldn't we do that in a different way? And who is that somebody, and how much time do they have to put together the plan? So that work session is also tomorrow afternoon. So it's going to be a pretty exciting afternoon in the Energy Building. Anybody wants to meet me at the Cross Building, we can have lunch and take some popcorn up to the committee room.
It's an experience.
It is very interesting.
It's an experience.